The sky over Oakwood Estates had turned a bruised shade of purple, the kind of color that made your skin crawl before the first drop of rain even hit the pavement. For Elias Thorne, that sky wasn't just a weather pattern. It was a countdown. He stood in his driveway, sweat stinging his eyes as he lugged another heavy, sand-filled vinyl tube toward the perimeter of his property. Elias wasn't a man who left things to chance. He was a retired civil engineer who had spent 30 years studying how water moves, how it destroys, and how it can be tamed. He knew that the creek sitting just 50 yards behind his house was no longer a peaceful stream. It was a sleeping giant, and it was about to wake up. As he secured the interlocking sections of what he called the Aegis barrier, a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down with a mechanical hum, revealing the sharp, pinched face of Beatrice Vane. She was the president of the Oakwood Homeowners Association, a woman who treated a slightly overgrown lawn like a federal crime. Behind her sat Marcus and Julian, the other two board members who functioned mostly as her echoes. Beatrice stepped out of the car, her designer heels clicking sharply against the asphalt. She looked at the 3-foot-tall reinforced flood wall Elias was constructing and let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snort. She asked him what on earth he thought he was doing. Elias didn't stop working. He told her he was protecting his life's work. He explained that the storm surge projections were off by 40% and that the neighborhood drainage system was clogged with debris the HOA had refused to clear last month. Beatrice folded her arms, looking at the industrial-grade barrier with pure disgust. She called it an eyesore. She told him it was a direct violation of Section 4 of the community bylaws regarding unapproved permanent structures. Elias tried to explain it was temporary, but she wouldn't hear it. She called his flood wall a joke. She laughed, telling him he looked like a paranoid child playing with Lego blocks in the mud. Marcus chimed in, saying that the city engineers said the area was safe. Julian laughed too, pointing at the wall and asking if Elias was expecting a tsunami in the middle of the suburbs. They stood there for 10 minutes, mocking his hard work while the wind began to howl through the trees. Beatrice pulled out a bright orange citation folder. She slapped a notice of immediate violation onto his mailbox. She told him he had exactly 1 hour to dismantle the joke of a wall or face a $5,000 fine and a legal injunction. Elias looked her in the eye, his face grim. He told her that in 1 hour, the fine wouldn't matter because the water would be at her front door. They laughed one last time, got into their climate-controlled SUV, and drove away, leaving Elias alone in the rising wind. The first hour passed in a blur of frantic preparation. Elias ignored the orange paper fluttering on his mailbox. He checked the seals on his barrier one last time. The rain started as a drizzle, then quickly escalated into a horizontal sheet of water that turned the world gray. He could hear the creek behind his house. It was no longer a murmur. It was a roar. He retreated to his porch, heart hammering in his chest. He watched the street. Across the way, Beatrice's massive colonial-style mansion sat proudly, its manicured lawn already beginning to vanish under a layer of shimmering water. Then the sound came. It was a deep, guttural crack, like the earth itself was snapping in two. The main drainage pipe 3 blocks up had succumbed to the pressure. A wall of brown, debris-filled water surged down the main thoroughfare of Oakwood Estates. It wasn't a gradual rise. It was an assault. Elias watched as the water hit his Aegis barrier. The wall groaned under the initial impact. The water swirled angrily, seeking a gap, a weakness, any way to get to the dry sanctuary of his home. But the wall held. Elias had anchored it into the bedrock himself. He stood on his porch, dry as a bone, watching the river pass him by. The same could not be said for the rest of the neighborhood. The HOA board members had been so confident in their bureaucracy that they had ignored the reality of physics. The water rushed over Beatrice's lawn. It didn't care about her designer heels or her bylaws. It smashed through her basement windows with the sound of a gunshot. It rose up her front steps, swirling around the pillars of her porch. Elias saw her front door fly open. Beatrice emerged, looking like a drowned rat. The arrogance was gone. It had been replaced by a raw, naked terror. She screamed for help, but the wind swallowed her voice. She looked across the street and saw Elias. She saw him standing calmly on his dry porch, protected by the very structure she had called a joke just 60 minutes earlier. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The water was now waist-deep in the middle of the street, carrying away trash cans, lawn furniture, and Marcus's expensive SUV. The board members were trapped. Marcus was perched on the roof of his car, which was slowly drifting toward a cluster of oak trees. Julian was clinging to a lamppost. They looked at Elias, their eyes wide with the realization that the man they had mocked was the only one who had seen the truth. Elias knew he couldn't just watch them drown. Despite the way they had treated him, he was an engineer, and engineers solve problems. He fought his way to his garage, which was also dry thanks to his barrier. He pulled out his heavy-duty inflatable rescue raft and a coil of climbing rope. The water outside the barrier was a churning mess of mud and sewage, but inside his perimeter, everything was eerily calm. He launched the raft over the side of his wall, tethering himself to the sturdy anchor points he'd installed months ago. He paddled toward Beatrice first. She was clinging to her front door frame, the water reaching her chest. When he reached her, she didn't say a word about citations or bylaws. She scrambled into the raft, shaking violently. Her house was ruined. He could hear the sound of furniture crashing inside as the current gutted her living room. Next, he maneuvered toward the lamp post where Julian was losing his grip. The man was sobbing, his face pale with hypothermia. Elias pulled him in, then headed for Marcus, who was now standing on the very top of his submerged SUV. By the time he got all three of them back to the safety of his dry property, the neighborhood was a disaster zone. They climbed over his flood wall and stood on his pristine, dry grass. They looked back at the street, which was now a raging river. Beatrice looked at the orange citation still stuck to the mailbox, now half submerged, but still visible. She reached out, her hands trembling, and tore the paper to shreds. She looked at Elias, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. She tried to apologize, but the words seemed to fail her. The silence between them was heavy. Elias didn't offer them comfort. He offered them blankets and hot coffee, but his eyes remained cold. He told them that the joke wasn't so funny anymore. He pointed out that if they had listened to his warnings at the board meeting 3 months ago, the entire street could have been protected. He had offered to design a community-wide system for free, but they had voted it down because it would interfere with the aesthetic of the neighborhood entrance. Now the aesthetic was mud and ruin. They sat on his porch, the 3 most powerful people in the neighborhood, reduced to refugees on the only dry island left in Oakwood Estates. The waters receded 2 days later, leaving behind a graveyard of soaked drywall and broken dreams. The damage to the neighborhood was estimated in the millions. Because the HOA had failed to maintain the drainage systems and had actively blocked residents from installing flood protection, the insurance companies were starting to push back. The legal storm was just beginning, and this time, Beatrice Vane was in the eye of it. A week after the flood, a town hall meeting was held in the local high school gym. The atmosphere was electric with anger. Dozens of homeowners had lost everything. When Beatrice stood up to speak, she was met with a chorus of boos. She tried to claim that the storm was an act of God, something no one could have predicted. That was when Elias stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. He held up a digital recorder. He played the audio he had captured on his security camera the day of the flood. The entire room heard Beatrice's voice crystal clear. They heard her calling the flood wall a joke. They heard her laughing at the warnings. They heard her threatening a man for trying to save his home. The silence that followed the recording was deafening. It was the sound of a reputation shattering. Within 24 hours, the entire board was forced to resign. A class action lawsuit was filed, spearheaded by the very evidence Elias had provided. Elias Thorne didn't gloat. He was too busy. The new interim board had approached him with a desperate request. They didn't care about aesthetics anymore. They wanted him to design a permanent version of his wall for the entire community. He agreed, but on one condition. Beatrice and her cohorts would have to pay a special assessment fee to fund it, a fee that would ensure they were the ones who paid for the protection of the neighbors they had ignored. Today, if you drive through Oakwood Estates, you'll see a beautiful, landscaped stone perimeter. It looks like a garden feature, but inside is reinforced steel and high-density vinyl. People call it the thorn wall. And nobody, absolutely nobody, calls it a joke anymore. Elias stands on his porch every time it rains, watching the water flow safely away, a man who knew that when the world tries to drown you, you don't ask for permission to build a boat.